The first snow of December was falling over downtown Boston, the night Eleanor Hayes finally decided that hating Julian Cross was no longer a hobby, it was a personality. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cross Whitfield Tower, the city looked like a half-finished oil painting, smudged at the edges where the snow blurred the streetlights into halos. Inside, on the 47th floor, the open plan office had emptied hours ago. The cleaners had come and gone. The motion sensor lights had given up on Eleanor twice already, plunging her cubicle into a blue dusk before she stood and waved her arms at the ceiling like a woman flagging down a rescue ship. 3 years. 3 years she had given to this building, to this man, to the unglamorous and unrelenting machinery of corporate strategy. And tonight, in the quiet, in the cold, in the glass, she could finally name what she felt about it. She did not feel ambitious. She did not feel grateful. She felt tired, and she felt furious, and she felt like a woman who had run out of polite ways to swallow either feeling. Her desk was a battlefield in an undeclared war. 3 half-empty mugs formed a defensive perimeter around her keyboard, each ringed with the dried tide marks of a different coffee. A dying basil plant her sister had given her 2 birthdays ago slumped beside the printer, its leaves the color of regret. A printed copy of the Whitfield merger memo sat in the center, marked in her own handwriting with 11 red question marks, 2 angry underlines, and 1 spectacular and entirely unprofessional doodle of a small horned goat. The goat, in her private logic, was Julian. She was very fond of the goat. She had stayed late, again because Julian Cross had emailed her at 4:52 with the words, "Need this rebuilt by morning." "Your draft is fine. We can do better." 6 words. Your draft is fine, it was, and Eleanor had checked. The warmest sentence Julian Cross had ever written to her in 3 years. She had, in response, considered going home. She had, in response, bought another coffee. She had, in response, stayed. Cross Whitfield was the kind of consultancy that did not advertise. It did not have to. The clients came on referrals so quiet they were almost rumors. Sovereign funds, pharmaceutical conglomerates, 2 former heads of state, on retainer, for things no one ever spoke about in the elevator. At the top of this discreet little empire sat Julian Cross, 36, the youngest senior partner in the firm's 70-year history, who had taken over the strategy division at 29, and who was, depending on whom you asked, either a genius or a glacier. Eleanor had, for 3 years, been firmly in the glacier camp. He was not loud. He was not cruel. He did not raise his voice or fire people in front of others, or do any of the cinematic things bad bosses did in the streaming series she could not afford to subscribe to anymore. He was, instead, quiet. He was unreadable. He was the kind of man who walked into a meeting at exactly 9 a.m., took the seat at the far end of the table, listened for 45 minutes without saying a word, and then in the last 90 seconds dismantled an entire strategy with 3 sentences and left. He had once, in Eleanor's first month, listened to her present a 40-slide deck for 16 minutes, and at the end had said only, "Slide 11 is wrong. Slide 19 is brilliant. The rest is noise." He had been correct on every count. She had hated him for it ever since, in the careful, professional way one hates a man who has done one no actual wrong, but who has never, not once, said the word good to her face. 3 years. 3 years of red ink on her drafts. 3 years of we can do better, and needs more rigor, and this is not yet the version I want. 3 years of watching him walk past her cubicle on his way to the corner office without making eye contact. His charcoal suit cutting through the bullpen like a knife through still water. 3 years of him being, by every metric the firm tracked, the architect of her career, and by every metric her own heart tracked, a man she would, given the option, push gently into a pond. She loved her job. She loved it the way you love a difficult relative, which is to say, with grievances. She had, over those 3 years, grown sharper, faster, more strategic. She had been promoted twice. She had been given bigger files, harder clients, the kinds of late-night calls that meant a junior was being trusted with dangerous things. She knew, somewhere underneath the resentment, that she had become the analyst she now was largely because Julian Cross had refused to let her be anything less. She also knew, somewhere underneath that knowing did not make her like him. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, the office was empty. Tonight, the snow was muffling Boston into a velvet hush. Tonight, she had been working on the Whitfield rebuild for 4 straight hours, and her mind, the way minds do at 1 a.m., on cold floors, had begun to misbehave. Her own laptop, somewhere in the slow tragedy of its 3rd year of life, had decided 40 minutes ago to die. The screen had flickered, the fan had wheezed, and the cheerful little spinning wheel had appeared and rotated, in Eleanor's professional opinion, with malice. She had restarted it twice. She had whispered to it. She had performed the ancient corporate ritual of unplugging it and plugging it back in. Nothing. Around her, the building hummed gently, the way buildings hum when they have been left alone with their secrets. Eleanor stood up. She rolled her neck. Her shoulders made a small, exhausted sound. She walked, in stocking feet, across the bullpen, past the dark cubicles and the dying potted ferns, and the cheerful and slightly threatening employee of the month wall, toward a part of the floor she almost never visited. Julian Cross's office. The corner. The glass. The kingdom. She did not, in any normal universe, have any business being in that room. She also did not, in any normal universe, give it a second thought. Tonight was not a normal universe. Tonight was a universe in which her laptop was dead, her draft was due by 7 a.m., and there were only 2 computers on the entire 47th floor that were still logged in to the firm's secure network. Hers. And his. The senior partners had a private rule. Any analyst could use a partner's machine in an emergency, provided the partner was not in the building, provided the analyst logged the access in the system, provided no client documents were touched. Eleanor had used the rule once before, a year ago, on a different floor, on a different partner. It had felt then like a small tame heresy. Tonight, walking toward Julian Cross's office, it felt like opening a door in a fairy tale. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. Julian, in his glacial certainty, did not lock things. He did not need to. The room behind the door was a dark cathedral of glass and oak. 2 walls were windows. The other 2 were lined with bookshelves, the kind of bookshelves that did not pretend, full of old hardcovers with their spines gone soft. There was a long desk, a single low lamp, a chair so quietly expensive it almost embarrassed her, and on the desk, a sleeping laptop, its small white indicator light pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. Eleanor sat down. She felt, immediately, like a small illegal child. The chair adjusted itself to her weight with the discreet hiss of money. The lamp gave her exactly enough light. She put her cold hands on the keys, woke the laptop and stared, for a single dizzy second, at Julian Cross's home screen. It was, of course, immaculate. No clutter, no icons, a single neat dock. A wallpaper that was not a beach, not a family, not a logo, but a black and white photograph of a long, empty road in what looked like rural Iceland. Eleanor exhaled. Of course it was an empty road in Iceland. Of course. She opened the secure network login, typed in her own credentials and prepared to pull her draft from the cloud. Her hands were steady. Her heart was, surprisingly, also steady. She was not afraid. She was tired, and she was annoyed, and she was, somewhere very deep down, a little proud of herself for being the woman bold enough to sit in this chair, even by accident, even at 1 a.m, even with snow falling outside the glass like a patient witness. And then, Her eye caught it on the corner of the desk, half tucked under a hardcover copy of a book she had not read since college, was a phone. Not Julian's main phone. She knew his main phone. He carried it everywhere, slim and black and unkind. This was a different one. Older. Slightly scuffed at the corner. The kind of phone people kept when they did not want anyone to know they kept it. The screen was on. The screen had been on, she realized with a cold tilt in her stomach, the entire time. He had left it. He had walked out of the building, into the snow, into wherever Julian Cross went at night, and he had forgotten his second phone on his desk, and the screen, by some accident of recent motion, was glowing. There was an open message thread on the screen. The contact name at the top of the thread, in clean white letters, was a name she had spent 3 years not letting herself see. Eleanor. It was her. Her own name. There was a single message in the draft box. Unsent. There was a long, long thread above it. A thread that had to have 100 messages in it. None of which had ever, in 3 years, arrived on her phone. Eleanor's heart, which had been steady, did something unsteady. She stood up. She sat back down. She told herself, very clearly, in a voice she had been using on herself for 31 years, Eleanor Margaret Hayes, you put that phone down. And then, because she was, after everything, a woman, and a tired one and a furious one, and a woman whose name was glowing on a phone she had not been meant to see, she did not put the phone down. She picked it up. The thread in the soft underwater light of the screen was very long. The first message was dated 3 years ago, almost to the day. The most recent draft, the unsent one at the bottom, had been typed just that afternoon. Eleanor's mouth, which had been functioning normally as a mouth up until that moment, went entirely dry. She sat in Julian Cross's chair, in Julian Cross's office, with Julian Cross's secret phone in her hand, and felt something in her chest that was not quite fear, and not quite wonder, but the strange electric cousin of both. The first message, 3 years ago. You started today. I watched you in the lobby, looking up at the directory like you were reading a foreign language. You wore a green coat. You looked terrified. I should have said hello. I did not. J. Eleanor closed her eyes. Opened them. The message was still there. She had owned a green coat 3 years ago. She had bought it on clearance 2 days before her first day, because her old coat had a hole in the lining, and the hole had been visible from the back. She had stood on her first morning, in the lobby of Cross Whitfield Tower, looking up at the directory, because she had genuinely not known which floor was hers, and she had been, yes, terrified. She had not, in 3 years, mentioned the coat to anyone. The coat had gone, at the end of that winter, to a charity bin in Alston. Eleanor scrolled down. Day 3. You raised your hand in the new higher orientation and asked the speaker, very politely, why slide 6 contradicted slide 2. Marcus, who was speaking, did not have an answer. He said something about context. You wrote something in your notebook and did not push it. You should have pushed it. J. Day 11. Your 40-slide deck on the Hartman account. You were good. You were better than good. You were correct. I told you slide 11 was wrong and slide 19 was brilliant. I did not tell you that slide 19 was the best piece of work any junior had brought into that room in 4 years. I should have. I did not. I do not know why I did not. J. Eleanor put a hand to her mouth. The room, around her, was very quiet. The snow against the window made a small, tender, uneven sound, like someone breathing into glass. Month 2. You wore your hair up for the first time. You have a small mole behind your left ear. I have no business knowing this. I am writing it down anyway, because I want to be honest, somewhere, with someone. even if that someone never reads it. J. Eleanor's hand went, before she could stop it, to her own ear. The mole was there. Of course it was there. She had had the mole since she was 7. Her grandmother had told her it was a fairy's thumbprint. Month 4. You laughed today, in the kitchen, at something Priya said. I heard you from the hallway. I had not heard you laugh before. I stood in the hallway for 40 seconds, pretending to look for the coffee, listening. I am ashamed of that 40 seconds and grateful for it in equal measure. I will not tell you. I will not. J. Eleanor felt a tear, ridiculous, unannounced, slide down her cheek. She wiped it away as if it were evidence. She kept reading. Some of the messages were short. You corrected me in a meeting today. You were right. I let you stand by it. You did not flinch. Some of them were long, paragraphs of careful self-argument, a man writing himself in circles, working through reasons why he could not, would not, must not send these. You are my employee. You are 11 years younger. You have watched me for 2 years treat you like a problem to be solved, because that is the only way I have ever known how to look at anyone I am afraid of. I cannot rewrite any of that with a single message at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. So I will not. So I will write it here. Some were apologies. I told you today that your draft was fine. Your draft was not fine. Your draft was extraordinary. I told you we could do better because I did not know how to tell you that you had already done it. I am sorry. I will not send this. J. Some were memories. Your sister called the office today by accident. She thought she was calling your cell. She left a message with the front desk that said, "Tell her Marie called, and the basil is doing great." I did not know you had a sister. I did not know you owned a basil plant. I do not know why I am writing any of this down. Some were confessions she had no map for. I went to your reading. I should not have. The bookstore in Cambridge. Last March. You read for 15 minutes from a story you had written about a woman who learns to forgive her mother. There were 11 people in the audience. I was the 12th. I stood at the back, behind the cookbook section, and I listened, and I did not know I had been waiting, until that moment, to hear your voice say something other than a quarterly review. I left before the questions. J. Eleanor's whole body had gone still. She had given exactly 1 reading in her life, in March of last year, at a small independent bookstore in Cambridge, on a Wednesday night, to an audience of, she had counted, 11 people. Her mother had not come. Her sister had been in Berlin. The 11 faces had been 3 of her writing group friends, the bookstore owner, 2 strangers, and a small, polite, disinterested old man who had, halfway through, fallen asleep. She had not seen Julian Cross. She had not, in any plausible accounting of the universe, been within 50 miles of Julian Cross at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night in March. And yet, there were more. Dozens more, months and months of small, terrible, tender entries, never sent, never spoken. You came back from your father's funeral 2 days early. You did not have to. You did. You sat at your desk that morning with your eyes red and your pen moving, and Priya stopped at your cubicle 3 times and you waved her off 3 times, and I watched you from across the floor, and I have never in all my life been so afraid for another person and so afraid to walk 30 feet across a room. I should have walked. I did not. I sent flowers, anonymously. They were, you told Priya, beautiful. I am sorry I did it that way. J. Eleanor remembered the flowers. White peonies. No card. Priya had assumed they were from her ex-boyfriend Marcus, and Eleanor had not corrected her, because the truth that no one in particular had sent her white peonies had been more than she could carry that week. She had thrown the flowers away 3 days later, when they had begun to droop, and she had cried alone in the bathroom on the 47th floor for exactly 4 minutes, and then she had washed her face and gone back to her desk. She had never told anyone about the 4 minutes. She had certainly never told Julian Cross. She kept reading. Today I overheard you, on the phone with a recruiter, telling them you were not ready to leave yet. The recruiter offered you 20% more than I am paying you. You said no. I do not know why you said no. I do not deserve for you to say no. I would not blame you for going. I am writing this anyway, because if I do not write somewhere that I am grateful, I am afraid I will start to forget that I am. Some were dark. I have been told, again by my mother, that I am cold. She is correct. I have been told again by my brother that I will end up alone. He is correct. I do not know how to be otherwise. I have spent 15 years building a life out of restraint. I am very good at restraint. It has cost me everything except this office. I am 36, and the only place in my life where I feel like a person is in a small thread on a phone, talking to a woman who has never once in 3 years called me by my first name, because I have never given her permission to. I gave the permission to no one. I gave it to no one because I was afraid of what would happen if I gave it to her. I am writing all of this down because writing it down is the only honesty I have left. J. Eleanor put the phone down. She put her face in her hands. The snow kept falling. The chair held her, gently, as it had been built to. Somewhere below, in the white silent city, a snowplow scraped a long, slow line down a side street. The 47th floor was so quiet, she could hear her own pulse. She did not know how long she sat that way. Eventually, because she was a woman who had, for 3 years, treated her work as a kind of prayer, she sat up, wiped her face on the sleeve of her sweater, and looked at the most recent message in the thread, the unsent one. The one he had typed that afternoon and not sent, and walked out of the building and forgotten on his desk. Eleanor, I am leaving the firm. I told the partners today. They will announce it on Monday. I told them I had been offered a chair at a school in Reykjavik that I have wanted, quietly, since I was 23. This is true. It is also not the only reason. The other reason is that I have realized, finally, after 3 years, that I cannot keep being your boss and continue, secretly, in my head, in this thread, to be a man who is in love with you. It is unfair to you. It is unfair to me. It has begun, lately, to be unfair to the work. I am not telling you any of this. I will leave quietly. You will get the promotion you have earned. Marcus will be your new partner. He will be kinder than I was. You will, I think, finally be free of me, and you will, I hope, never know what you were free of. Be well, Eleanor Hayes. Be loud. Be impossible. Be exactly what you have been. Good night. J. Eleanor read it twice. She read it 3 times. She read it the 4th time, with her mouth open, because she realized, stopped breathing. I am leaving the firm. I told the partners today. The strategy division, on Monday morning, was going to wake up to a memo. She, on Monday morning, was going to wake up to a man she had spent 3 years calling, in the safety of her own head, the goat, leaving the country, leaving the company, leaving the building, leaving her. Without ever, once, telling her any of this. Eleanor stood up so fast the chair rolled backward and hit the bookshelf with a small, tasteful thunk. She put the phone, very carefully, exactly where she had found it. She walked, on legs that were not entirely her own, to the door. She stopped in the doorway. She turned around. She walked back. She picked up the phone again. She read the message one more time. Then she picked up her own phone, in her own pocket, the cracked one, the one with the case her sister had given her with the small embroidered cat on it, and she opened a blank email, to herself, and she typed, in shaking thumbs, 3 lines. Do not pretend you did not see this. Do not pretend you do not feel this. Do not pretend, Eleanor. She sent it. She put Julian's phone. Exactly where it had been. The angle, the corner, the half cover of the book. She backed out of the office. She closed the door. She walked, in stocking feet, across the empty bullpen, with the snow falling outside the windows, with her draft still unfinished, with 3 years of one story collapsing behind her into another, and she sat back down at her own dead laptop, and she stared, in the blue dusk, at her own dim reflection in the black screen, and she said, out loud, to no one, in a voice she had not used in a very long time, the word. Oh, she did not finish the draft. She did not, in any meaningful sense, work for the rest of the night. She sat at her desk until 4 a.m, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold 3 rotations of a snowplow ago, and she did the only thing she could do, which was think. She thought about the green coat. She thought about the white peonies. She thought about the bookstore in Cambridge, and the man in the back, behind the cookbooks, listening to a stranger read a story she had written for no one but herself. She thought about every meeting in 3 years in which Julian Cross had not looked at her, and she understood, with the slow, sickly clarity of someone rereading their own life, that he had not looked at her because he could not afford to. She thought about every red mark on every draft, and she understood, finally, that she had been wrong about almost all of it. Not the marks. The marks had been correct. Slide 11 had been wrong. The Whitfield draft had needed rebuilding. Her work had been good, and he had, every single time, made it better. She had been wrong about the man. She had built a small private cathedral in her head, with him as its frozen saint, and she had brought all her resentments and all her exhausted late nights to its altar. And she had, for 3 years, treated her hate of him as the plumb line that kept her honest. And the man, the actual man, the man with the second phone and the empty road in Iceland and the secret unsent record of every laugh she had ever let out in his vicinity, was not that saint at all. He was just a man. A quiet, careful, frightened, restrained man who had, in his own broken way, loved her in silence, and who was about to, in 3 days, disappear. By the time the first gray light came up over Boston Harbor, Eleanor had made a list. She always made lists. The list was short. 1. He is leaving on Monday. 2. He does not know I have read any of this. 3. I cannot tell him I read any of this. 4. I have, until Monday morning, exactly 78 hours to decide what I do with the rest of my life. She stared at the list for a long time. Then she added, in smaller letters, almost shyly, 5. Be loud, Eleanor. Be impossible. It was, she realized, his handwriting in her own life now. She did not know how to feel about that. She did not have time to know. She went home. She showered. She slept for 90 minutes. She came back at 9. The Whitfield draft was somehow on Marcus's desk by 10, only 20 minutes late. Marcus, who had no idea that anything had happened, frowned at the lateness, scanned the document, and said, in the impatient, half-distracted way that was simply how Marcus said things, yeah. Fine. This is good. Eleanor looked at him for a long, slow second. Marcus, the man Julian had decided would be kinder. Marcus, who would in 3 days be her new partner. Marcus, who was, undoubtedly, kinder. Marcus, who had also never in 2 years noticed that her basil plant was dying. Thanks, she said. She walked back to her desk. Across the floor, through the glass of his office, she could see Julian. He was on a call, standing by the window, his back to the bullpen, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his main phone to his ear. From this distance he was, as always, unreadable. The way he stood, the way the suit fell, the faint angle of his head. She had spent 3 years cataloging that silhouette and writing, in her private mental margin, the word unkind next to every entry. Now, today, watching him, With her own private set of receipts in her chest, she could see the other thing. The way his shoulders did not quite relax, even when he was alone. The way he stood about 10 inches from the glass, like a man who could not quite trust himself to lean against it. The way, when he turned slightly, she could see, in the line of his jaw, what she had never let herself see before, which was that he was tired. Not cold tired, not glacier tired. Tired the way people are tired when they have been performing a single difficult sentence in a single difficult role for 15 years, and their voice, finally, is starting to give. He turned. He saw her looking, for one full second, across 40 feet of carpet and 3 years of armor. He looked back. And Eleanor, who had spent 3 years not letting Julian Cross see anything in her face except professional courtesy, allowed, just for a moment, the smallest, faintest, almost not there ghost of a smile. He blinked. He looked away. He turned back to the glass. She sat down. Her hands, on the keys, were trembling. 78 hours, she thought. I have 78 hours. She did not that day have a plan. She did not that day even have the shape of a plan. She had only for the first time in 3 years the absolute unshakable conviction that she was not, under any circumstance she could imagine, going to allow Julian Cross to leave this country on Monday without him knowing, somehow, that someone in this building had finally heard him. The first thing she did, that afternoon, was something small. She found, in a drawer at home, the photograph she had taken at her one and only reading at the bookstore in Cambridge. The photograph was of the small chalkboard sign outside the shop, with her name on it in chalk, and the date, and the little hand-drawn doodle of a teacup the bookstore owner had insisted on. She had taken the photograph, that night, for herself. She had never shown it to anyone. She brought it back to the office that evening, in her bag, and she slid it, while no one was looking, on the bookshelf in the kitchen, on the third shelf from the top, propped between a coffee-stained binder of HR policies and a forgotten copy of an annual report from 2017. Anyone could have walked past that shelf for a year and never noticed it. One person, she thought, would notice it the very next morning. She left at 9. She walked home through the snow. She did not look up at the 47th floor on her way out. 12 hours later, on Friday morning, when she came back in, the photograph was gone. She did not look in Julian's office. She did not need to. She knew with a kind of bone certainty that it was now somewhere on his side of the building, and that he had stood for a very long second in the kitchen, holding it. She sat down at her desk. She opened a new tab. She made the second move. The second move was a small, careful piece of professional sabotage. The Whitfield team had been quietly considering, for 2 months, a single equity buyout option that Julian had championed in a partner meeting and that 2 other senior partners had grumbled about. The option was, by Eleanor's analysis, the correct one. It was also not the easiest one to sell to the board. Eleanor had, in the previous version of her life, written a polite memo about it, presenting both sides, hedging carefully. Today, she opened a new document, and she wrote, instead, a 15-page strategic argument, coldly, ruthlessly in favor of Julian's option, with footnotes, with stress tests, with 3 modeled outcomes, with the kind of conviction she had spent 3 years carefully not putting in writing, because she had been carefully not letting herself agree with him in print. She finished it at 2 a.m. She sent it, with a CC to Julian, with a subject line that said simply, Whitfield, pushed. He responded at 2:11. Read it tonight. We will talk Monday. J. She stared at the email for a long time. We will talk Monday. He did not know, yet that she knew he was leaving Monday. He thought he had 3 days of normal left. She gave herself, in his calendar, the first hour of his last week. She typed back, looking forward to it. And she meant it, in a way that surprised her, with a clean, hot, unexpected fierceness. The third move was harder. The third move was the one she did not, for 2 days, know how to make. She tried, on Friday night, to write him a letter. She wrote 4. She tore them all up. They were either too much or not enough, either confessions of having read the unsent thread or pretendings that she had not, and she could not, with any honesty, choose between those. She tried, on Saturday morning, to call him. She dialed his number twice and hung up before it rang. She tried, on Saturday afternoon, to do nothing at all, to simply let him leave on Monday and never tell him any of it. Because, she told herself, what right did she have? What right did she have to interfere with a man's careful goodbye? What right did she have to walk into a chapter he had clearly, painfully, intentionally written without her in it? She could not, however, do nothing. She had never in her whole life been able to do nothing. By Sunday morning, with the snow having finally stopped and the city coated in a soft, embarrassed white, Eleanor Hayes put on her old coat, the new one, the navy one she had bought herself when she had finally been able to afford a real coat, and she took the train across town, and she walked into the small independent bookstore in Cambridge where 18 months ago, 11 people, plus secretly 12, had listened to her read a story she had written for herself. The owner remembered her. He smiled. "Eleanor Hayes," he said. "We were just talking about you. I have been meaning to invite you back." "Thank you," she said. "Actually, I am here for something strange. Do you by any chance still have the chalkboard sign from my reading?" He laughed. "I have every chalkboard sign from every reading we have ever had. I keep them in a closet upstairs. My wife thinks I am insane. Could I," she said, "buy that one?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said gently, "you can have that one." She walked out of the bookstore with a small, dusty, 18-month-old chalkboard sign tucked under her arm, with her own name on it in slightly smudged white chalk, and the date, and a hand-drawn teacup, and she walked all the way home with it, in the cold, with snow squeaking under her boots, and she felt, the entire way, like a woman carrying something live. She did not sleep. On Sunday night, she sat at her kitchen table, with the chalkboard sign propped on the chair across from her like a small, quiet guest, and she wrote, by hand, on a single sheet of cream paper, 3 sentences. She wrote them 7 times, on 7 sheets, until the wording was right. Then she folded the 7th sheet in half, slid it into a plain white envelope, and wrote on the front of the envelope, in her clearest, most deliberate handwriting, the single letter J. On Monday morning, at 6:30, before anyone else was on the floor, before the cleaners had finished, before the snow had quite finished its second small storm of the season, Eleanor Hayes went into Cross Whitfield Tower for the last time as the woman she had been on Wednesday night, and she walked, in her navy coat, across the empty bullpen, and she went into Julian Cross's office. She did not sit in the chair. She did not touch the phone. She did not look even toward the corner of the desk where, 3 nights ago, an unsent message had tilted her entire life. She propped the chalkboard sign, very carefully, against the spine of the empty road in Iceland on the bookshelf, where it would, in the right light, look almost as if it had always been there. She placed the white envelope on the keyboard of his laptop. She walked out. She closed the door. She went down to the lobby. She bought a coffee from the cart in the corner. She walked back up. She sat at her desk. She turned on her own machine, the one it had finally fixed, and she opened her inbox like a normal woman on a normal Monday, and she waited. The floor began to fill. Priya came in at 7:40, the way Priya always did, and dropped a granola bar on Eleanor's desk without breaking stride. The way Priya always did, and Eleanor said thank you, the way she always did, and Priya said don't die today, the way she always did, and went on. Marcus came in at 8. The senior partners began to gather, quietly, in the boardroom at the end of the hall, for the meeting that would, at 9 become a memo, that would, by 10, become an announcement, that would, by lunch, be the only thing the entire firm was talking about. Julian came in at 8:20. Eleanor saw him through the glass. He did not look at her. He went into his office. He closed the door. For one long, terrible minute, nothing happened. Then, behind the glass, she saw him stop. She saw him stand very still in the middle of his own office. She saw him notice the chalkboard sign on the bookshelf. She saw him, for one full breath, do nothing. Then she saw him walk, slowly, to his desk. She saw him pick up the envelope. She saw him open it. She saw him read 3 sentences. The sentences, on the paper in her hand, said, "I read what you did not send. I am not so. I have something to say. E." She watched him read it. She watched his hand, holding the paper, do something it had never done in 3 years, which was tremble. She watched him sit down, slowly, in his chair. She watched him, for what felt like an entire weather system, simply stay there. Then, he stood. He walked to the door of his office. He opened it. He looked. Across the bullpen, across 40 feet of carpet, and 72 months of careful silence, directly at Eleanor Hayes. She stood up. He did not say a word. He held the door open. She walked across the floor, in front of every analyst on the strategy team, in front of Priya with her mouth slightly open, in front of Marcus pretending not to look, with her shoulders back and her chin up and her hands not, by any small mercy, shaking, and she walked into his office, and he closed the door behind her. The first thing he said, when the door was closed, was, "How much?" His voice was quiet. "All of it," she said. He closed his eyes. He put a hand, briefly, to his forehead. "All of it," he repeated. "The whole thread," she said. 3 years, including the one you typed Wednesday afternoon, the one about Reykjavik. He opened his eyes. "Eleanor, don't," she said. "Don't tell me you are sorry. Don't tell me you should not have written any of it. Don't tell me it is more complicated than I think it is. I am, with respect, the most complicated person you have ever underestimated, and I have spent 3 years specializing in things that are more complicated than they look." His mouth, very slightly, did something she had never seen it do. It almost smiled. "Eleanor, are you going to Reykjavik?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I have signed the contract," he said. "The chair starts in March. Then you have until March. Until March for what?" "To convince me," she said, "whether you take that chair alone or whether you take it with a strategy consultant who has this morning decided that she is in fact willing to entertain the idea of moving to a country with very long winters." For one full second, Julian Cross, the glacier, looked at her with his mouth slightly open, like a man who had stepped, in heavy boots, onto a frozen lake and found to his enormous surprise that the lake had taken his weight. "Eleanor," he said, "you are not serious." "I am extremely serious," she said. "I am, in fact, more serious right now than I have ever been about anything in my professional or personal life, which, given that I have, as you noted in February of last year, the personality of, quote, a polite hurricane, end quote, is saying something." "I did not say polite hurricane. You wrote it down, in a message I did not send." "You wrote it down," she said softly. "Once you write something down, Julian, it counts." He sat down on the edge of his desk. He put his hands very carefully on either side of him, as if he needed the desk to remain solid. "Eleanor, yes, I have been your boss for 3 years. Yes. I have been a coward," he said, "for every one of them. Yes. I cannot," he said, "take any of that back." "I am not asking you to take it back," Eleanor said. "I am asking you to stop." The leaving Monday in silence, the disappearing into Iceland, the pretending the thread was a thing you wrote for no one. I am asking you to be, for the rest of this conversation, The man who actually wrote those messages, because that man is the one I have spent the last 78 hours finally being able to see, and I am not letting him leave the country without me having met him properly, at least once. He looked down at the paper in his hand. The 3 sentences. Be loud, he said quietly, almost to himself. Be impossible. That part, she said. I owe to you. He looked up. The morning light was slanting through the window. The snow had started again, in tiny, polite, unconvincing flakes. The bookshelf, behind him, held, as of an hour ago, a small, dusty chalkboard sign with her name on it. The phone, the second one, was nowhere on the desk. He had, somewhere, hidden it. She could see, in his face, the shape of a man very carefully trying not to do something he had been carefully not doing for 36 months. Eleanor. Yes. May I come around this desk? Yes, she said. He came around the desk. He stopped, 2 feet away, with his hands at his sides. I am, he said, in a voice she had never heard, very afraid of doing this badly. Julian. Yes, you have done this, she said softly, very badly, for 3 years. The bar is, frankly, on the floor. He laughed. It was a short, surprised, almost broken laugh, the kind of laugh a man makes when something inside him finally exhales. Eleanor. Yes, he did not in the end kiss her in his office. He was, even now, even at the exhale, even at the bar on the floor, a man with a careful sense of place. He took, instead, her right hand, the one that was not holding her own coffee, in both of his, and he held it for 1 long second, and he said, quite simply, Then I will spend, every day, for the rest of however long you let me, doing it less badly. And Eleanor Hayes, who had spent 3 years hating Julian Cross, and 78 hours unhating him, and 1 envelope's worth of paper redrawing the entire map of her life, looked at this man, and at his glass office, and at the snow, and at the small, embarrassed chalkboard sign on his shelf, and she said, very steadily, Good. Start now. 6 months later, in the late spring, in a small apartment in a quiet street in Reykjavik, Eleanor Hayes sat at a kitchen table, in a sweater 2 sizes too big for her, with a mug of tea in her hands and her laptop open beside her, and watched, through the window, a particular kind of northern light spill itself, slow and pink and unhurried, across the rooftops of a city she had never, in any version of her old life, imagined she would call home. She had, in those 6 months, done a number of things she had not, on the night of the snow, been able to imagine. She had given notice at Cross Whitfield, exactly 2 weeks after the morning with the envelope. She had, against her own private expectations, accepted a counteroffer, but a different one, on different terms, with different rules. The firm, eager not to lose her, had offered her a senior advisory role she could perform from anywhere, on a 4-day week, with a research stipend, with a promotion she had, frankly, earned a year ago. She had, with a small, satisfied internal chuckle, taken it. She had, in February, packed 2 suitcases, kissed her sister Marie on the forehead at Logan, fed the basil plant a final, defiant cup of water, and flown to Iceland. She had spent the first month not, in fact, living with Julian. She had taken a small flat of her own. She had, on principle, refused to walk into his life. The way a woman walks into a man's life, the way her mother had done 35 years ago, with no shape of her own. She had built, instead, a small, new shape. She had taken Icelandic lessons, very badly, on Tuesday and Thursday nights, and was now able, with great seriousness and almost no accuracy, to order a sandwich and ask for the bathroom. She had begun, in the quiet of long nights, to write again, in the way she had not written since the bookstore. She had, much to her surprise and Julian's quietly visible delight, finished a short story collection, which a small literary publisher in Edinburgh had, 3 weeks ago, agreed to publish, in a print run of 700 copies, which was, by every objective metric in the world, not a lot of copies, and which felt to Eleanor like the entire population of a small country. She had, in her work life, run 2 strategy projects for the firm, remotely, in pajamas, with a coffee mug that said "Be loud, be impossible" in Marie's handwriting on the side. She had, on weekends, traveled with Julian. They had gone to a little fishing town on the north coast, where the wind ate hats. They had driven, once, the long empty road in his old wallpaper, and she had stood at the side of it and laughed, because the photograph, from above, had not done justice to how the road looked when the sky over it went the color of a bruise. She had met his mother, a small, sharp, terrifying woman who had, after 20 silent minutes of dinner, looked at Eleanor and said, in clipped English, "You are not what I expected, Miss Hayes." And Eleanor, without missing a beat, had said, "I gather, ma'am, that I am, in fact, a polite hurricane." Julian, beside her, had inhaled his wine. His mother, after a long pause, had laughed. The laugh had sounded, Eleanor noticed, exactly like her son's. She had, in that moment, decided, privately, that she would, in time, like this woman. She had been, mostly, correct. She had also, in the very mundane matter of her actual relationship with Julian Cross, been for 6 months something like radiantly happy. They were not loud about it. He was not a loud man. She was not, in her private life, a loud woman. They had set, on day 1 in Reykjavik, 2 rules. The first rule was that if she ever, at any point, felt that she was inside the relationship the way she had been inside her job, which was to say, slightly resentful, slightly invisible, slightly worn at the edges, she was to say so, immediately in plain words. The second rule was that he was, every Friday night, before they did anything else, to read her, out loud, 1 entry from the thread. Not all of it. They were not punishing themselves. Just 1. 3 years was a lot of small notes. They had, 6 months in, only just gotten to month 7. He was reading them, she had begun to suspect, slowly on purpose. Tonight, in the kitchen, in the long pink light, with her tea and her laptop and the new chapter of a novel she had not, on the night of the snow, even known she was about to begin, Eleanor Hayes heard the front door open. "Eleanor," Julian said, from the hallway. In here, he came in his coat, with snow in his hair, although the snow was, by the calendar, supposed to be over. He put a small paper bag on the counter. He had, she could tell by the smell, brought her the apple cake from the bakery on the corner, the one she liked. He had brought it, she noticed, without being asked. He had, in fact, started doing things like that around month 2. He came around the table. He put his hand, briefly, on the back of her neck, a small, possessive, slightly ridiculous gesture that would have, 6 months ago, embarrassed her into nervous laughter, and now simply made her, for 1 second, close her eyes. "Friday," he said. "I know. Are you tired?" "No." Then, he sat down across from her. He took, from his inner pocket, the second phone. The same one he had, against her gentle expectation, kept it. They had agreed on day 1 in Reykjavik that it was now their archive. He did not write new entries on it. He wrote those, now, on paper, in a small leather notebook she had given him for his birthday, and he gave them to her, openly, on Saturdays. The phone was for the old ones, the ones she had read, in the dark, 3 nights before her old life ended. He flicked through. He stopped on month 7. He cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he read. "Yes. You came to work today in a green scarf." "Did I?" "You did. I noticed it because I had by then given myself a private rule that I was not allowed to notice anything you wore. The rule was that the rule existed, because if I let myself notice even once that you had a green scarf, I would also have to admit that I knew, in some quiet corner of my head, that the scarf matched the coat you had worn on your first day. I did not want to know that I knew that. I knew it anyway. I am writing it down, because writing it down is the only honesty I have left. J. He stopped. He looked at her over the top of the phone, with the small, slightly tired, slightly hopeful expression of a man who had spent 20 years training himself not to make that expression. Eleanor, in the long pink light, with her tea cooling and her cake unopened, and the rooftops outside going slowly dark, felt the same small, hot, ridiculous tear she had cried 3 nights, 6 months, and 1 entire life ago, in his office, slide quietly down her cheek. "Julian." "Yes, I still have the green coat," she said. "No, you do not," he said gently. "I bought it back." "You what?" "The Alston charity bin," he said, "had a partner thrift shop in Brighton. 3 years ago, the day after you donated it. I bought it." "Julian Cross, Eleanor Hayes, you have it. It is in the closet," he said. "In Reykjavik. In our closet. In our closet," he said. And his ears went, very faintly, pink, which was, she had learned, the closest thing he had to a blush. Eleanor stood up. She walked around the table. She sat, without ceremony, sideways in his lap, with her arms around his neck and her forehead against his temple, and she breathed in the smell of cold air and bakery and him, and she said quite softly, into the scratchy collar of his coat, "You absolute, terrible, careful, secretly ridiculous man." "Yes," he said. And I love you," she said. "Even when you steal my coats out of charity bins." "Eleanor." "Yes, I love you," he said, "even when you read my mail." She laughed. He laughed. The kitchen, in Reykjavik, in the long pink light, with the apple cake in its paper bag and the laptop blinking quietly with its half-finished page, and a small embroidered cat case sitting on the table beside a leather notebook full of small Saturday confessions, was, in that moment, very full. Outside, the city was settling, in its slow, polite Icelandic way, into the particular blue of a northern night. Below, in the building's mailbox, 3 blocks back, in his office in Boston, on a desk that now belonged to Marcus, in a drawer that no one else had a key to, in a thread that, in any sensible accounting of the universe, should never have been read, the past was, finally, archived. And Eleanor Hayes, 31 years old, who had once stood in a dim cubicle on the 47th floor of a glass tower, with a goat doodled on her draft and 3 years of polite hatred in her chest, smiled into the collar of a difficult, redeemable, secretly ridiculous man, and decided for the second time in her life that she had, somehow, accidentally, against every plan, walked into the right office at the wrong hour, and read against every rule exactly the right message at exactly the right time.